So, as Professor Rossius is experiencing right now severe technical problems, we need to make another changes. Well, before that, changes were slight. Now, first change is that we lack the chair of the session. And so, I'm afraid I have to usurpate this place. Second thing is that we will proceed in a following pattern. We start with two regular pages for this papers for this session, and then remember that we have a brilliant perspective of the reception at 6 o'clock before us. So then, depending on the schedule, we'll see, or on the technical problems of Professor Rossius, we will see whether he will be able or not to make it. Okay? Does this sound okay? Все поняли? We'll see. I think that there will be a choice. Maybe. Maybe it will materialize in a while. So, for that matter, I have a pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Christian Orth. Dr. Orth got his PhD from the University of Freiburg, and where he's working right now. He published a book with translation and commentary on the fragments of Stratis, and as we heard during the previous session, he's now in the course of preparing Anapsias. So his main topic is ancient comedy, on which he will speak today. Доктор Орт получил свой докторат от университета Фрайбурга, где он работает в данный момент. Он издал комментарий, перевод и комментарий фрагментов Стратида, и сейчас, как мы слышали во время предыдущего заседания, готовит издание фрагментов Анапсиса. Please.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Winzer and Anna Rokatko for inviting me here, for the possibility to speak on a somehow paradox subject, talking about structure, where structure has been lost. And yes, as you see, some of the authors just mentioned will appear also on my handout, and I will speak on several of the fragments which I have been studying here. So my talk will consist of 3 sections. First, some general reflections on the criteria for identifying comic fragments that come from a prologue. Second, the discussion of several fragments which may be attributed with different degrees of probability to a comic prologue. And third, some reflections on what we may gain for the study of comic prologues from the fragments. The prologues of the 11 comedies of Aristophanes, the only completely preserved plays of old comedy, are of considerable length. Following the analysis of Thomas Gelzer in the Aristophanes entry in Paulis Real Encyclopedia, between 11.8 in words and 24% in Ecclesiazusae of the verses belong to the introductory scenes which precede the arrival of the chorus in the parables. In most of the earlier plays, the percentage is about 15%. In the later plays, usually a bit over 20%. One reason for the higher number in later plays could be the diminished number of verses sung or spoken by the chorus. It is therefore very probable that a major part of the extant fragments from old comedy belong to prologue scenes. But before we can ask the question in how far these fragments enrich, modify, or correct our general picture of comic prologues, there's another more basic problem. How can we identify at all fragments which come from comic prologues? One possibility is to look for single elements which are found in the prologues of completely preserved plays and are particularly characteristic for prologue scenes. Here are some examples. First, many Aristophanic plays begin with the dialogue of two persons who are on their way to a certain place. For example, let's say, beginning of birds, Thesmophoriac suicide, frogs, and whales. Second, slaves play an important role in Aristophanic prologues. Knights, wasps, and peas begin with the dialogue of two slaves. Frogs and whales with the dialogue of a slave and his master. Although the first words of Cario in Whales have a monologic character. Third, several plays of Aristophanes begin with a longer monologue in which a character, usually one of the main characters, speaks about his current situation and in most cases complains about it. A Carnian's clouds, and with only slight remains of a complaint also at least at suicide. Lysistrata, too, begins with such a monologue by the title hero, which is, however, soon stopped by the arrival of her friend Kaloniki. Fourth point, the spectators are often, after an at first confusing introductory scene, directly informed about the meaning of the opening scene and the theme of the play. Knights, wasps, peas, and birds are examples for this. In the prologue of Peace, presumed expectations of the spectators are explicitly mentioned and refuted. The fifth point, the gods which in contemporary tragedy and later comedy are often used as prologue speakers do not play an important role in the prologue scenes of the extant comedies of Aristophanes, except where there are themselves important characters in the plot, like Dionysus and frogs. But we know that Kalligenia, a goddess named after the third day of the Thesmophoria, which was called Takalligeneia, spoke the prologue in Aristophanes' second Thesmophorian suicide. And the personification of the first day of the Apaturia, Dorpia, introduces herself, probably in a prologue, in a fragment from Phililius Heracles, fragment 7, Castle Austin. So here already the fragments add some valuable information to the picture we would get from Aristophanes' plays alone. Apart from looking for typical elements of prologues in the comic fragments, we may pose the more general question if a fragment would fit into a scene which fulfills the purpose of a comic prologue. Geoffrey Arnold mentions as the two primary functions of openings, both in drama and other genres, that of introducing the story economically with a deceptive and convincing air of relevance, and secondly, that of engaging at the outset the full attention of the cold reader or spectator. So, one of the questions we may pose when trying to identify fragments from prologues is whether it first may contribute to engage the attention of the spectator, and second, more importantly, contains information that is relevant for the theme or plot of the whole comedy and likely to be offered at an early stage of the play. This, of course, we can only do where we have additional information about the play, for example, from what we can guess from the title or from other similar plays. Important work in the attempt to identify fragments from comic prologues has been done in particular in an important article by Whittaker, the comic fragments in their relation to the structure of old comedy, which appeared in 1935, and in many single notes dispersed in editions and commentaries of comic fragments. In the handout, you find a selection of fragments which either have been already attributed to a comic prologue, or can, in my opinion, be attributed with a certain probability to prologue scenes of plays of old comedy. These fragments I will now discuss in more detail. There's maybe no other fragment of old comedy which can be assigned more confidently to a prologue than Plato Comicus fragment 182 Castle Austin. It's number 1 on the handout from Plato's Hyperbolus, a play which is directed against the demagogue with this name. And it has been identified as belonging to a prologue already by Whittaker and other scholars. I read just the English translation, which usually follows story. You can follow also the Greek text on the handout. A says, speaker A, congratulations, master. B, for what? You were selected to serve on the council. Well, almost. Though you weren't selected, you were, if you understand. What do you mean, if I understand? Because you were chosen as an alternate to a nasty foreign person, not yet a free citizen. And then, probably a bit later, you get out of here. Gentlemen, I will in fact explain the situation to the people. I am an alternate on the council to Fabulous. Strictly speaking, it is not one but two fragments, which come probably from the same scene. Although the connecting Kai and Tau To in the Scholia to Aristophanes' Thesmophoria Susa 808 means only that they come from the same play. A slave informs his master in a dialogue, which is in the beginning puzzling both to his master and the spectators of the play, about his having been elected as a Bouleutes, a member of the council, at least almost. Later, he sends his slave away and addresses with Andres the audience directly. He explains that he has been elected as a substitute for Hipparchus, who, we have to add, is very likely not to pass the dokimasia required for becoming a member of the council. We do not know how many verses are missing at the beginning of the play before verse 1, and how many verses have been omitted between verse 6 and 7 of our fragment. But the declaration to the audience makes sense only if it has not yet been stated before explicitly that Hipparchus is the person that speaker B is to substitute. And it's quite possible that Hipparchus' name is mentioned here for the first time at all in the play. If the spectators knew the title of the play, many of course will have already suspected it. This means, however, that the master of the servants too is not likely to know anything more than what he has just been told by his slave. And it means also that when he later addresses the audience to explain the plot, he is unlikely to have any additional evidence to the words of his slave, apart from the words of his slave already heard by the audience. This particular fact marks the prologue of Plato's Hipparchus as an interesting variation from prologues of Aristophanes, where characters that know about it from the beginning address the audience to introduce them to the theme of the comedy. Another interesting question, which cannot be answered here, is how and why the slave did get to know about the election before his master did. Is he just back from the Agora and heard the latest news there? Just one possibility. Maybe we can make a guess too about what might have been omitted between line 6 and 7. These lines cannot have contained much substantial information, since otherwise no further information of the audience would be necessary anymore. Instead, the root up arrow with which the master tells his slave to leave seems to imply that the slave has just strained the patience of his master and possibly also of the audience by some entertaining jokes, which do not contribute anything to the plot, but make the spectators both laugh and expect more anxiously the following information about the theme of the play. So we find here together several elements which are typical also for Aristophanic prologues. A dialogue of a slave with his master, an at first puzzling situation, and an explication of the theme of the play directed to the audience. And, just as importantly, the fragment is directly connected with the plot of the play, at least as far as we can guess from the title of the comedy, and fits very well as an introduction to a comedy about, or rather against, Hipparchus. Another interesting case, where a fragment which presents some parallels to Aristophanic prologues is at the same time also directly connected to the theme of the play, as far as we can tell again from the title, is Stratus Fragment 1, Classic Austrian, from the Anthroporestes, number 2 on the handout. I read again the English translation. Now I didn't care about the other songs, but he ruined Orestes, Euripides' most clever play, by hiring Hegelochos, the son of Kintaros, to play the leading role. The person speaking, probably in a monologue, or at least a longer account, compared to the beginning with Kai, complains about the Archon who ruined Euripides' Orestes by hiring Hegelochos as the main actor. There's a quite similar complaint of Hermes at the end, near the end of Pluto, in Aristophanes' Pluto. The allusion to a recent event outside the play, the presentation of the Orestes in 408 BC, which is however also connected to the title of Stratis' play itself, Anthroporestes, a combination of Anthropos and the name of Orestes, and the complaint, which reminds one of the similar complaint about theatre performances in the prologue of Aristophanes' Acanians, would fit very well in an introductory scene to a play in which an ordinary mortal could have played the role of or behaved like Orestes, thereby, for example, but there are other possibilities, showing the bad influence of Euripides on the Athenians. If this hypothesis about the context of the Anthroporestes, the content of the Anthroporestes is correct, and if, as in most monologues or prologues of Aristophanic plays, the protagonist of Stratis' play speaking here himself, the preserved verses would have, apart from satire against the actor Hegelochos, also the important function of characterizing the speaker quite early as a devotee of Euripides who likes in particular the Orestes. Another fragment, which both from its content and its possible connections to the title of the play could be assigned to a prologue scene, is Kephisodoros fragment 3, Castle Austin. There are two speakers first. And then Xanthias played, please buy for me some iris and rose scent to anoint my body with, and separately for my feet buy some baccharis. The slave answered, you sister on earth, I shall buy baccharis for your feet, I'll do anything rather. Baccharis? The master gives orders for purchases to his slaves. The personal relationship between them seems to be similar to that of Dionysus and Xanthias in Aristophanes' Frogs. Kephisodoros Xanthias is similarly cheeky and disrespectful as his namesake in the Frogs, and his master seems to be similarly effeminate as Dionysus in Aristophanes' play. The lively dialogue, with its obscene elements, would fit well into a prologue scene, and it seems evident that some preparations are made for something that will happen in the course of the play. Of course, this fragment would fit well also in many places a bit later in the comedy, not exactly at the end, but there are many scenes really which we could imagine. So attributing this fragment to a prologue seems one possibility, but not a necessary assumption. The title suggests that the subject of the play might have been a visit at the famous oracle of Trophonius in Boeotian Levadea, and it is well possible that preparations are made for it here. We know from Pausanias that the visitors of the oracle had to take cold bath in a river nearby, and that they were anointed with some oil. Another fragment, fragment 6, Castle Austin, which may or may not belong to the same scene as fragment 3, mentions ges mectris, a kind of fuller's earth, used also in baths. If our fragment is directly connected to a visit at Levadea, we might therefore assume that the master has quite different expectations and seems to imagine the visit rather as a trip for pleasure. One would be curious to know if these expectations were fulfilled in the course of the play. If this fragment is assigned to a prologue, another interesting question emerges. Do the visitors of the play and Xanthias in this moment already know for what purpose the purchases are made? There is nothing in the fragment to suggest an answer. Although the surprised reaction of the slave may might also be caused by his ignorance of what his master is playing. But it's, again, not a necessary assumption for explaining his reaction. Two possible situations, which both would fit well in a prologue, have been suggested for Alcaius fragment 3, Castle Austin, from a play called Ganymedes, number 4 on the handout. Lame one, hurry up, or you will be struck by lightning. We know from the anti-athicist, who cites the fragment, that Zeus is addressing Hephaestus here. Nesselra imagines a scene similar to Homer Iliad 1, 597 to 600, where the limping god is mocked by the other gods during his work as a cup bearer, and suggests that the god's dissatisfaction with his work might be a reason to take Ganymedes as a substitute. A second possibility would be a dialogue between Zeus and Hephaestus on their way to the palace of Troy, where they plan to kidnap Ganymedes. Nesselrad's objection that Hephaestus would not be an obvious choice to accompany Zeus here can be countered by the argument that such a constellation would have much potential for comic jokes, and the comic poet certainly would have enough fantasy to find some justification for it. And it's just the absurdity of such a situation which makes it particularly fitting for a comic prologue. Many plays of Aristophanes too begin with two characters on their way, and often they are quarreling, because one of them is more quickly getting tired than the other. A scene with Zeus and the limping Hephaestus on their way to kidnap a beautiful boy would certainly be an interesting beginning for a comedy on the myth of Ganymedes. On similar grounds, another fragment of Alcaius can be attributed with a certain probability to a prologue, fragment 10, Castle Austin from the Endymion. Because for nearly 3 whole months now I have been keeping watch on Endymion. The present tense in the fragment implies that the speaker is in this moment still watching the presumably sleeping Endymion, which means that Endymion, or at least the building in which he is sleeping, must be nearby and probably visible on stage. Now the speaker tells us that he is keeping watch already for almost 3 months, which makes most sense at the beginning of the play. Although we cannot be sure from the preserved words, it seems quite likely that the speaker, maybe Hypnos or some other god who now does work which is more fitting for a slave, is complaining about the monotony of his task. Whether from a dialogue or a monologue, the fragment works well under the assumption that it is part of a prologue in which the audience gets important information about the situation and which mentions also, possibly for the first time, the character from which the play got its title. Presumably later in the play, attempts are made to wake Endymion up. Story suggests that the doctor mentioned in fragment 11, and compare also fragment 12 with the medical context, medicine, was fetched to wake Endymion up, and adds, dramatic purposes require that someone wake up sleeping beauty. Similarly, Stratus fragment 16, Castle Austin from the Kinesias may be assigned to a prologue. This is the tent of the chorus killing Kinesias. The fragment identifies as Kene, probably a tent visible on stage, by naming the person to which it belongs, the dithyramographer Kinesias. Maybe this is the first time that the character after which the whole comedy is named is mentioned in the play, sometime before he really appears on stage. The next parallels for the fragment come, however, not from comic but from tragic prologues. For example, the beginning of Sophocles' Philoctetes, verse 1 and 2, Electra, verse 6 to 7, and Euripides' Cyclops, verse 20 to 22. And it is well possible that there were more paratragic elements in the play. From fragment 17, Castle Austin, we know that Kinesias was addressed at least once in the play as Theod Achilleo, and the same address is found also in Aeschylus Myrmidones, a play which was still well known in Athens at the end of the 5th century BC, as the references to this play in Aristophanes' Frogs show. The subject of Aeschylus Myrmidones, which is taken from the Iliad, is Achilles' absence from the battle because of his anger against Agamemnon. And we know from Aristophanes' Frogs, line 911 to 913, that in the beginning of that play, Achilles is sitting for a long time silently in or in front of his tent. Stratus could have used a similar constellation for mocking the cowardice of the thin, ailing and unwarlike Kinesias, and it is possible that Stratus Myrmidones, a title which is preserved just once and which is missing in the Suda's list of the titles of Stratus plays, is just an alternative title for Kinesias. The fragment from Stratus Kinesias leads us to a category of fragments which are without direct parallel in Aristophanic prologues. That is, to fragments which directly parody tragic prologues. Very similar to the beginning of some Euripidean prologues is Aristophanes' fragment 1, Castle Austin, from the Iolocicon, number 7 on the handout. Back from Thearion's bakery I come, where lie the abodes of ovens. Translation from Anderson in the little edition of Aristophanes. The words are particularly close to the beginning of Euripides' Hecuba. Verse 1 to 2 read, Heco nekron kertmona kai skotu pylas, Nippon, hin hades choris opistai tenu. Aristophanes' Iolocicon seems to combine the myth of Iolaus, who married off his 6 daughters to his 6 sons, with contemporary daily life in the character of the cook Sikon. The speaker, which is coming from a bakery, might be a slave or the cook Sikon himself. But can we be sure that the fragment comes from the prologue of Aristophanes' play, just because it takes up the beginning of a play of Euripides? Any character who comes on stage in any moment of the play could introduce himself in this way. It would be maybe helpful if we had at least the name of the speaker who comes there. Then we could say it's quite probable he comes for the first time, but we don't have. My last examples are taken from another play with mythological content, Stratus Phoenicia, number 8a to c on the handout. 2 direct citations from Euripides' eponymous play, fragment 47 and 48, show that this comedy is most probably a full-scale parody of a Euripides play. But there is at least one significant difference in the plot. Fragment 46, Castle Austin, I read again the translation. I am Dionysus, involved with Thyrsus, Aulus players and revelries. Here I am, trapped by the wickedness of others, hanging on a branch like a fig. Shows that Dionysus, who introduces himself with these words, was a character in Stratus' play. The first verse cites the beginning of another play of Euripides, the Hypsipyle. We know this because the same verse is cited also in Aristophanes' Frogs, in the famous scene in which Aeschylus manages to fit into the opening of any play of Euripides the words Lekytion ab Olesen. Might the fragment of Stratus belong to the prologue too? There is a second fragment of Stratus Phoenicia, which has been tentatively attributed to the prologue by Georg Kaibel. This is fragment 50, Castle Austin. Egoga auton parapagodes sai timoi. I think you find the translation on the handout. The beginning of the second verse is corrupt beyond repair, but we would expect a verb like kelero to complete the syntax. For the same, quite similar words there is in Aristophanes' clause, but from a quite different context. This fragment is the earliest extant example of the word paratagodeo, a word that may just mean to speak in tragic style, but seems particularly suggestive in a play that parodies a complete tragedy of Euripides. If auton refers to the poet Stratus himself, a possibility which I rejected in my commentary, perhaps wrongly, the speaker may well be Dionysus. In my commentary I suggested tentatively Dionysus as a possible speaker for fragment 49, where the entire city of Thebes is addressed. You, the entire city of Thebes, understand nothing at all. First, as they tell me, you call the cuttlefish a rear squirter, the rooster a chicken, the doctor a bagman, and so on. It's a long list of expressions of the Boeotian dialect which sounded strange to Athenians. This suggestion, which I regarded and regard still as very uncertain, has won the approval in a recent review of Horst-Dieter Blume. But is Blume also right in assuming that Dionysus entered not only at the end of the play, but spoke also the prologue, and that fragment 46 and fragment 50 belong to this prologue? The citation of the beginning of the Hypsipyle in fragment 46 alone is inconclusive. There's an important difference in the fact that in Stratus fragment 46, Dionysus himself is speaking, while in the beginning of the Hypsipyle, someone is talking about Dionysus in the third person. An appearance of the god Apomechanes might seem more fitting for the end of a play, although it is far from clear whether the appearances of the Deus Ex Machina in Euripides' plays were really Apomechanes. And the heteromochterion would be better motivated, maybe, if it refers to errors the characters have made in the course of the play, and which now force Dionysus to hang on the mechane. Echo is found in speeches of Euripidean gods, both at the beginning and the end of plays, in the first verse of Troilus, but also in Andromache 12:31. Similarly, yes, there were Aphikomen in Ion 15:55. Fragment 52 would fit equally well at the end of the play, in a speech of the god Dionysus explaining why all the things that happened in the play had to happen. Because Dionysus had told the poet to do some paratragedy. If we really want to attribute see that here the god is speaking about the poet, which is again one of several possibilities. So while it might well be possible that Dionysus appeared both at the beginning and the end of Stratus' play, both fragment 46 and fragment 50 fit equally well into the speech of the god appearing near the end of the play as they would fit into the prologue. The question must be left open and may serve to illustrate the difficulties which may make the task of identifying fragments from prologues at times a very risky one. I hope to have shown so far that the study of comic fragments under the question whether they might belong to a prologue can produce interesting, if hypothetical, results, and I would like to add some more general reflections on what we can gain for our knowledge on comic fragments. First, the fragments enrich the pictures which the prologues of the preserved plays of Aristophanes offer by showing that other poets too used similar techniques and motives as Aristophanes, and suggest that we would see the prologues of Aristophanes in a quite different light if more plays by his rivals were preserved. On the one hand, much that to us seems an original invention of Aristophanes might turn out to be a common motive of many poets. And on the other hand, we would understand some details of his prologues in a completely different way if we could understand in how far there are direct references to earlier comedies, and which are really important new twists Aristophanes adds to the tradition. Second, the fragments show not only similarities, but also interesting differences to Aristophanes' plays. Of particular interest are fragments which contain enough elements found also in Aristophanic prologues to make an attribution to a prologue seem probable, but still are different enough from all that we know from Aristophanes' plays to add some new insight, or at least in some matters of detail. Third, one aspect in particular, the importance of tragic models for the development of the comic prologue, cannot be studied at all without the help of the fragments. But here often the identification of fragments from prologues is particularly difficult, and further research, which includes also the fragments of later Greek comedy and the prologues of Menander, would be necessary to throw light, for example, on the question how much the divine prologues in new comedy owe to tragic models. I would like to conclude with a methodological warning. As fascinating the results from the identification of fragments from prologues might seem, they always remain hypothetical and incapable of proof or disproof. What is possible up to a certain degree is assessing their probability, but when we base further reaching conclusions on them, we always must be aware of their hypothetical nature. For understanding the fragments themselves, it is, however, indispensable to keep in mind that they were once part of a larger context, a complete comedy intended to be presented on stage. Only by asking for every fragment the question of its possible context in the play, we can at least, to some degree, be freed from the often quite limited interests of the authors to cite the fragment, and only in this way we may be saved from serious misunderstandings which follow from ignoring the fact that there was once a wider context, and that each preserved fragment was once part of the word an actor spoke on the stage in a certain dramatic situation, as part of the whole comedy.
A very ingenious and subtle paper. Now, the time for questions. Вопросы? Yes.
I have two questions actually. One is about the first fragment. What are the arguments? You seem to be very sure that the human and the others are the audience, right? And how can you be so sure?
You cannot.
Два вопроса. Первый вопрос касается первого фрагмента. По мнению доктора Брие, докладчик уверен в том, что адресуется к аудитории. Да? Какие кому есть основания?
Okay, first, we cannot be completely sure. We have many parallels that have already also been collected by other scholars, where Andres in comedy really refers to the audience. We have really from earliest to latest time, we have a lot of instances. We have certain examples, we have other examples where it is very likely. But we must say we cannot be completely sure. What convinces me that it is probably the true answer here is also the fact that we have exactly the same pattern in some prologues by Aristophanes, in which, in this way, after a at first confusing scene, then there's an address to the audience and it's explained what is really happening in the play. Third thing, well, it's difficult for me to see a plausible alternative here, but of course, it's a problem we have in general almost always in the comic fragments. Certainty cannot be attained. We have to calculate with likeliness and see what is more and is up to a certain degree subjective.
Ну, с фрагментами комедии никогда ни в чем нельзя быть полностью уверенным, но существуют другие параллели, где в комедиях происходит такое обращение к аудитории, что убеждает доктора Орта, так это то, что есть параллели именно с прологами Аристофана, где после первой сцены некоторого замешательства происходит обращение к аудитории. Но, конечно, это лишь не совсем достаточное доказательство. Кроме того, он просто не видит сколько-нибудь убедительной альтернативы, хотя и это тоже нельзя считать стопроцентным убедительным доказательством.
Yes, the second question, well, remark maybe, is about the Ganymedes fragment. You have the same kind of threat in the dialogue, in Lucian, between Zeus and Hephaestus, when Zeus wants Hephaestus to open up, split up his head so that Athena can come out. And really the same kind of thing, urgent, it's urgent, and if you don't open my head right now, I will strike, I will strike you with my lightning. And the thing is, I really, because of that parallel, I don't think you can be sure at all. I would be really, that it's about going somewhere. It's not hurry up and go there, or hurry up and, it might be hurry up, do this. And that opens up so many possibilities that, I mean, really, it could be any scene, I think, in a Ganymedes drama, where Zeus needs maybe, I don't know, any kind of object or any kind of intervention.
A cup made for a love gift, for example. A cup made for a love
Yes,
gift.
yes, but there's also this thing about Ganymedes, walking among the golden objects. I mean, there are so many possibilities that I don't think you can rely on the idea that it's about going somewhere together.
Да, значит, второй вопрос или соображение касается фрагмента с Ганимедом, поскольку у Лукиана есть очень похожее место, когда Зевс говорит с Гефестом и говорит: скорее сделай это, или я тебя ударю молнией, а под этим имеется в виду, что Гефест должен стукнуть его по голове, чтобы из нее родилась Афина. Эта параллель указывает на то, что в случае с Ганимедом здесь вовсе не обязательно предполагать, что люди куда-то идут, то есть не люди, что, в общем, кто-то куда-то идет, поскольку вполне возможно, что просто есть желание получить что-то, как предположил профессор Олсен. Допустим, он просит или приказывает Гефесту срочно сделать чашу для подарка возлюбленной. Так что здесь очень трудно на этом основании высказывать какие-то соображения.
Okay, I would answer that you're perfectly right. There are many more possibilities, but there's at least one element in the fragment which suggests that it might really be about going somewhere, and it's addressed as Hephaestus as katachon, as the lame one, the one which directly refers to his problems with walking, his problem he has with his legs. That's the one thing which makes me...
If he was accusing him of being too slow for anything, he would say, you lame one, no?
But I think maybe lame one in English sounds more, general it's just someone who is slow, but this katacholos, I think, has a bit more specific meaning in Greek, which is not just about being slow with anything.
Значит, ответ заключается в том, что да, конечно, возможностей может быть весьма много, но здесь есть одно указание, что он именует Гефеста хромым, да, и, собственно, прямо указывает на его проблемы с ходьбой, на что доктор Бие заметил, что если он вообще что-то хотел, чтобы тот сделал, а он это не делает, он, в принципе, мог его обозвать хромым, в смысле неторопливым. Но на что доктор Орт предположил, что греческое слово скорее предполагает все-таки именно ходьбу, а не просто у тебя плохо с реакцией. Yes, please.
I just would like to add something about the fragment of blood corpus. You not only have the same patterns like in Aristophanes' products, but almost the same modes. So,
but the
Ulin,
right?
tobacco,
Yeah, okay.
so it's very well attested.
Да, это просто добавление, что есть к этому месту параллели у Аристофана, который именно в таком контексте. More questions? Please?
So, Christian, I'll confess I got so interested in what you were saying that at one point I stopped listening to you and started paying attention to this. So I may have missed a crucial point there. So let's just say there's preference. It looks, I'm interested in fragment 8a. And as you want to talk about as usual, story, it seems to me, has made a complete mess of the translation. But as I understand what the Greek actually says, it says that I have come hanging here as a consequence of the bad behavior of other people. Right? That's what the Greek actually says, regardless of how story translates it. So in other words, so this must be a Deus entry, right? So he's hanging up, and it's the consequence of the bad behavior of other people. So presumably this is somehow referring to what we get in fragment 8c, which is the description of the problem with thieves, right? So perhaps you said exactly that, but it looks to me like this cannot be anything except the end of the play, referring to the previous action in the play, and that being a moktheria, the consequence is Dionysus' appearance here at the end of the play. So perhaps I simply missed what you said, but I wanted to be sure that's what's going on.
Профессор Уилсон начал с того, что он настолько был увлечен тем, о чем говорил доктор Орцев, в какой-то момент углубился в текст и, может быть, что-то пропустил, поэтому хотел просто уточнить. Что касается фрагментов 8а и 8c, то здесь ему кажется, что они непосредственно связаны. В фрагменте 8c, собственно, описывается большие проблемы, которые есть у фивакцев. И то, что говорит Дионис в 8а, нельзя интерпретировать с точки зрения профессора Уилсона никак иначе, как скорее финал комедии, где он, собственно, описывает, что случилось с ним в связи с такими нехорошим поведением жителей Фивы.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's exactly what I tried to say, maybe not so clearly. You said it now, that I regard it as much more likely that it comes in the end of the play, and just because of this the heteronocteria, and I think it really refers to the mess that has been has happened in the play before. But I just discussed this last piece because it has several times, these fragments, some of the fragments have several times been attributed to a prologue, and my attribution, also in my commentary, attributed to the last end of the play has been questioned again, so I want to come back.
Ответ «да», я именно это имел в виду, и, собственно, старался это показать, хоть не так очевидно, но обратился доктор Орт к этому фрагменту специально, потому что обычно довольно часто предлагали этот фрагмент атрибутировать к прологу. Он в своем издании поместил его как раз в конец, и это тоже вызывало вопросы, поэтому он еще раз хотел продемонстрировать свою аргументацию.
Christian, two questions, both out of curiosity. First, is the competition of prologues and the frogs should be considered as a unique case to the whole purpose of the comedy, and that's why it's irrelevant for us that it's not in the prologue. And all these lines, I mean, if we wouldn't have the whole frogs, but only the fragments of the frogs, how would we consider these tragic lines of prologues there? And the second question is, what's, in your opinion, or perhaps your knowledge, the percentage of quoted prologues in the whole comic fragments corpus? Again, because don't you think that prologues are quoted more often, like first lines of the poems in modern poetry is automatically quoted more often because people just remember the first line.
Я привожу, да? Значит, вопрос состоит в следующем, то есть два вопроса. Первый вопрос, есть ли какие-то аналогии соревнованию прологов, да, которые мы имеем в лягушках, и если переформулировать вопрос, то что бы было, если бы лягушки на нас не дошли, а дошли бы только цитаты из трагических прологов, которые существуют в лягушках? Куда бы мы их отнесли, не отнесли ли бы мы на этом основании их к прологам? И, соответственно, второй вопрос, вообще какой процент из трагических цитат во фрагментах относится к прологам, поскольку вообще-то прологи могли цитировать, ну, как цитируют вообще литературу в принципе, поскольку любят цитировать первые строчки.
Только не трагических, а вообще из
Да,
всех фрагментов комедии.
да.
Okay, to the first question, I was only interested now in the parody of tragic prologues inside comic prologues. So I did not talk about these examples from the frogs where they talk just about tragic prologues inside a comedy. But then there's an interesting question where we have just fragmentary material and we have a fragment which is just one line which sounds like a line from a tragic prologue. It can of course also have been part of a discussion like the one in Aristophanes' Frogs. Exactly. This is always a possibility we have to bear in mind. And then also persons, for example, can enter the stage speaking like a prologue speaker in tragedy, but it must not necessarily be in the prologue of the comedy, it can be much later. We have this citation of a verse from the first verse of Euripides' Hypsipyle, which we know exactly because it is also quoted in this scene of frogs which you mentioned. But we have, as we see it, it's most probably near the end of Stratis Folgenszeit. So we have a big problem in particular with these fragments, comic fragments, which reminds us of tragic prologues. We cannot automatically assume that they must also come from a prologue.
Да, что касается первого вопроса, то действительно здесь серьезная проблема, поскольку мы не можем на основании того, что встречаем в фрагментах что-то похожее на трагический пролог, автоматически атрибуировать это прологу, поскольку, ну, в конце концов, даже просто человек может входить на сцену со словами из пролога, потому что он входит, а в действительности это может происходить далеко не в прологе комедии. И как раз пример с Гипсипилой хорош, что благодаря как раз лягушкам мы знаем, что это пролог, а получается, что у Стратида, скорее всего, это было как раз ближе к концу комедии. And what about the percentage of...
Yes, I also thought about this point, that for citations, usually it's true, it's more probable that more citations come from the beginning of plays. For papyrus fragments, probably it would be the opposite, because often the beginning is lost in the papyrus roll, but for the citations, you can say, if we start from this percentage of 15 to 20% of the lines that are part of the belong to a prologue in the place of Aristophanes, probably the amount of comic fragments from prologue, the percentage is rather higher than lower. The problem is, but of course, how to identify them. How many? There must be much more fragments of comic prologues which we would never guess, or we have just no hint at all to say that they are really from a comic prologue, but still, yes, there must be many undetected fragments.
Ну, здесь судить, конечно, сложно, но учитывая, что в комедиях Аристофана цитаты такие составляют примерно 15-20%, можно предполагать, что в комических фрагментах такой процент скорее должен быть высоким, чем низким, и поэтому можно предположить, что количество